Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time around we're going to be adding a bit more to the paintable canvas system. So we're going to be setting up some stuff to properly support brushes that actually already have colored pixels embedded in them. We're also going to be setting up support for being able to have user control of things like the strength of the brush and also the scale of the brush. So a few bits and pieces that we're going to be getting set up there. So let's dive on in with this. So there's a few things that I want to do to begin with. First thing I need to do is I need to set up our multicolored brush. So I've already created the texture for it. Now, there are going to be some things I need to set up on this, and I am intentionally not setting them up to begin with. And the reason for that is because having not set them up, it is going to cause some specific problems. And those problems are very, very easy to run into. And I kind of want to illustrate the problem that happens so that if you run into it in future, then you can actually have a good reference of how to fix it. So let's set up the actual scriptable object for this. So I'm going to base this off of one of the existing large ones. So this will be called multicolored large. I'm just going to link that to the new texture. And because it already has color built into it, I'm going to turn off it being tintable. And then what I need to do is my brush picker. I need to add that in to my set of brushes. So we'll do that. And we'll just update our prefab. So, okay, that's good so far. Let's test this out though. So if I run this, and we'll pick our multicolored brush. So I immediately get this error that it's not readable. And that's because I need to go to the actual texture. And if we take a look at one of the ones that has been set up, there's a slight difference here, but it's a crucial one of this read-write needs to be enabled. The other thing I need to enable is that alpha is transparency for this. So, okay, that's progress. Let's see what happens now if I select that brush. And we can see it doesn't really actually draw it properly. So, okay, we want to take a look and see what's going wrong with how this is working. So there's a couple of potential things that could be happening. So one of the big things that we want to check is, okay, is it actually going and generating this cached brush data? Because that's actually a crucial thing, because everything else afterwards uses that. So this should actually get run quite a bit, because that data is not set to be serialized. But, okay, it ends up running it for that one, but it hasn't run it for the multicolored one. So a couple of these it's running for, but a bunch of things it's not. And so data is getting persisted there for it, and it's not going and doing the setup despite our best efforts. So there's a couple of things we can do to ensure that it gets properly set up. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to be very explicit that I don't ever want this being serialized. It is a little bit of overkill, as is initializing it to null, but I have found that with scriptable objects you do get weird behavior at times, so it just helps avoid that. I will also change this check down here where it rebuilds the cache to also rebuild it if the cached brush data is null. Then I want it to rebuild that. So that looks pretty good. The other thing that I do need to change is how it works with sort of the intensity side of things. Because if we are using our non-tintable brushes, we don't want them to necessarily be the full intensity, because if we did that, then areas that we've got transparency on are going to come through fully. So what I want to actually do is, for non-tintable ones, we use the alpha channel. I think likely what I would do as a further change in the future is just migrate everything to actually using the alpha channel for intensity, but it just makes it, for the tintable ones in particular, those grayscale ones, makes it much easier to not be reliant upon the alpha channel for it. So that should help a bit with the behavior for the drawing of this. So let's test this out. And we're going to select our multicolored one. And now we can see that actually does draw the way that we would want. It doesn't apply this tinting, which is what we've intended, because we haven't marked it as being tintable. So, okay, that's good. That's behaving the way that we would want it to in this scenario, where it's actually going and being able to apply using the color from those. We didn't need to change too much to make that work, which is good. But there are further things that I want to actually do with this. So I want to add in support for being able to set the strength of the brush and set the scale, and do that from an actual UI control here. Because if we take a look at the moment in our canvas, we already have a default sort of scale setting, and there is just a default strength that's used for applying with stuff. So we want to actually improve this and make it something that is being configured by commands. So what I'm going to do for setting up those commands is I'm going to create a new painting command. And this is going to be, we'll have set brush, and I'm just going to copy that so I have to type in less. So one of the ones is going to be setting the brush scale. And then the other one is going to be setting the brush strength. So those are the two commands that we want to have available to us. And these commands are actually going to be pretty straightforward. There's not a huge amount to them. We'll be basing them off of our brush mode one here. So these both end up being a base painting command, which means we can get rid of our start and update setup there. So that's good. Now, in terms of them, what these actually look like, there's not really a lot to them. So we need to keep track of the scale to set. So we have this scale to set. We have our constructor. So they both have a constructor, and all that constructor does is it takes in that scale to set, and as we do for all of them, it takes in whether this is undoable or not, with that defaulting to true. We pass that in is undoable to the parent class, and we can just store our scale to set. So very little that we need to do there. For executing that, which is the main function that we need to actually set up, so execute, now that we need to be able to output a scale. So we have our out scale, and all we do is say out scale is our scale to set. So very straightforward for the command to set the brush scale. And our brush strength is actually going to follow the same process. So it has a strength to set, has the same thing with our initialization or our construction function, where we take in that strength and we take in the whether it's undoable or not, defaulting it to true. We pass that undoable setting to the base class, and we store the strength to set. And then we have our execute function, and that again takes a ref to a nullable float so that we can output our strength. And that is all we need to do with this. So the actual commands themselves are very, very simple. There's very little to them. There's a little bit we need to do for hooking those commands up, but the actual command logic itself is quite straightforward. So in terms of setting things up then for making it work, what we would do is we go to our paintable canvas. So we do already have settings here for our brush scale and our brush weight. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete those, because that's going to force us to have to set up alternate ones that have different names. We're going to have some UI, and that UI is going to need to be kept in sync. And the reason we need that synchronization function is because we have undo and redo support. We need a way to be able to push updated settings to the UI. So what I'll end up doing here is I'll set those up so we just get all of this up and running in one go. So with these, they just pass through a float and a bool, and this is on sync UI with brush strength. And we will also have one that is doing a very similar process. So a unity event, also with a float and a bool. So all of them take a bool as the second parameter. These events, they use that second parameter to indicate if notifications should be sent, because we don't always want to do that. And then we have with brush scale is a new as well. And then down here, where we've got these various nullable fields, this is where we want to have, okay, active brush strength, and also have an active brush scale. So what I'm doing here, and this was mentioned in a much earlier video, so good to do a refresher of it. Something like our brush is a class, so it can already be able to be null. All of these other ones, our color, our enum, and our floats, can't be set to null, but I want to actually be able to know, are these valid? Have they actually been set to something? And I want to be able to differentiate between that set versus not set. So making these nullable means until they're actually set, they're going to be returning back as null, which makes it really easy to be able to know whether they've been configured. So makes it really handy. There's a couple of helper functions I need to set up alongside these. So this is how our commands get into the stack. So we'll have a public void, and this will be our set brush scale. That will bring in a scale. We append a command, and it's a new painting command to set the scale. And we provide the scale value, and it's undoable if the active brush scale is not null. The reason being is that the very first time we set the scale, we actually don't want to be able to undo that. We want to always make sure that we have A scale and things like that set. So what this does is this ensures that the first selection of anything like a brush, the mode, color, all of those, that essentially represents the clear state for things, and we can't actually reset beyond that. We also have a set brush strength. That's going to take in our strength, and very similar process. Main difference is this is a strength painting command, but again we do that same check of the nullable one there. So that's good. We've got the logic for being able to bring in our brush strength, our brush scale. Now we actually want to do something with these. So that's actually a really important thing, is supporting being able to actually get things up and running with this. So, okay, if we head down to where we're hooking up our various commands, so we've got our logic here for setting the brush, and we can see that was trying to read from brush scale. So that changes to active brush scale dot value in both cases. So we make sure we're using the correct thing. So that's good. We want to add in support for our additional commands. So we'll have our in command, and this is something we could actually switch it over to a switch or something like that these days. And that's a potential option that we might want to do. It's not a crucial thing that we need to do, but could be a useful thing to actually get set up. So I'm going to, with our command, we cast it, our brush scale, and then we execute it, passing in that ref. Now, if this wasn't or if this is an undo or replay, we need to resync the UI. So F is undo or replay. This is where we invoke that function we set up, like that. Now the other thing we need to do is, because we have messed with the brush scale, this logic here has to actually be rerun. So what we would say is if we have an active brush, so if active brush is not equal to null, because the brush might not have been configured yet, then we go and set it. So if the active brush is valid, we just go and re-update that setting. Just ensures that it's actually going to always be correct and consistent. Then we need to add in support for our brush strength one. Now it's a much simpler one. We can just do the in command and as brush strength, we execute that. It has the same check for if we're doing an undo or a replay. Invoke that. That's all good. So that's hooked up those individual commands. So most of the actual painting side is now up to date for working with the changes here. We just need to modify where we're getting the brush weight. Change that. Or active brush strength is what we ended up calling it. And its value. So that's good. We've got inside the canvas now, we have all of the support for being able to handle changes to strength, things like that. So now that we've got the code side support for the brush strength, everything like that hooked up, the main remaining bit is actually setting up the UI for it. That's actually where most of our work goes with this, is setting up the UI. So we're going to dive in and get that up and running now. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the actual script for our sections of UI. So we already have, with our brush picker, a few different ones there. So I'm going to create one, and this is going to be our brush strength picker. And we will also have a similar thing that is going to be for our actual scale there. So we'll have our UI brush scale picker. Now, both of these are going to be very, very similar. The actual logic for them is quite similar. So both of them are going to have a TextMesh Pro GUI for the actual label. So this will be our picker label. They're going to have a slider as well. So this is going to be our picker slider. We're going to have our default value for this because we want to have our initial one. So our default value. So for strength, that's going to be defaulted to a 2. And we need to have a Unity event for it to communicate out when this has actually been changed. So sometimes the autocomplete gets ahead of itself. So a Unity event that outputs a float, and we'll just call this onValueChanged. So the reason I'm keeping the names here fairly generic is because in theory, I could actually use this same script for both. I'm not going to use the exact same one for both, but the reason for that is because we might want to do further customization later on. But for now, I can keep them pretty much identical because they are very, very similar. The main difference is that from a brush scale point of view, we're going to start the default at 0.25. And we have a lot more of these that need to get brought in. Seems to always kind of just miss one or two when it goes and you add in code. It does a pretty good job, but it does always miss some ones. So we don't need our update function in either of these at all. What we do need is we need something for when the actual slider value has changed. So we have a public void on slider value changed, and that gives us our new value. So when that happens, we invoke the onValueChanged. The other thing we need is we need a public interface for things like the undo system and that to actually talk to. That's where those Unity events we set up in the canvas actually connect into. So we also have here a public void, and we'll just call this set value, and this takes in the new value. I'm going to fix up my naming here. Takes in a new value, and then we have that second parameter for sending notifications. So our allow notifications, which we default to true. So what we end up doing is our picker slider, we set the new value. So we first set it without a notify. And what that will do is that means it won't go and call this function immediately because we don't want to always call that. What we do is we check if notifications are enabled, and if they are, then we invoke that. And we do a similar thing in start, where what we do is we actually do a set value of our default and we send through notifications. So this same logic, I can use this in my picker. So we're just going to take all of that, head over to the picker, and bring that in. As I said, you could use the same script for both, but I want to just make it easy for if I modify this script in the future, because I think that's a likely thing that I might want to do, is have those two diverge. So this just keeps easy support for that, even though the code is exactly the same. I could use inheritance for it, but I feel like that's a little bit of overkill with it. So, okay, now we need to actually set up the UI for it. And there's not too much to that. What I'm going to do with the brush picker here is I'm going to add our section under the brush picker. So we've got our brush modes already. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that initially, remove the picker from it, remove the horizontal layout group, and this is going to be our brush strength. And then we delete the contents of that because we don't need any of the contents. What I will do is I will create a label within that. Just shrink down the size of the text for that, because that text is just a little gigantic. We'll also align that properly, so that's a little better. Change our anchors so we can configure this just a little bit nicer. So far so good. Our brush picker itself, we're going to increase the height of that, just so we've got a bit more space for fitting these in. That one is anchored down the bottom. That goes there. Our brush list gets ordered added to it. So then we have our brush modes and our brush strength. So, okay, we've got our strength, we've got the label. In this case, we'll change that to say strength, like that. And I will also create a slider in there. And so for the slider, we're going to have that fill the lower section. So that looks good. We'll change its anchors and everything as well. So we want it to be taking up a lot more of the space here. That looks about right. The strength label here, we can probably shrink the size of that a little bit further. Don't want it to necessarily be taking up quite as much space as it was. So that looks good. In terms of ranges for the slider, we should configure that. So we know this is the weight. So we don't want a weight that is 0. So I'm going to say that the lowest weight can be 0.1. And the maximum value, well, we were using 2 as the weight, and this does get multiplied by time.delta time. So I might make it that the maximum weight is 5. And the default can just be 2. So that's good. That's our brush strength. And then we have our brush scale. Now this one will position slightly differently. Actually, this one is the one we'll move up. So we'll move strength up. We'll rename this. Now scale. I want to think about the size, sort of range that we potentially want to support here with this. So 5 times the size to 1/10 of the size. I might actually allow a bit larger again, but default it to 0.25. So that looks good. So I can link up our scripts now to this. So we have our brush strength script. That we can link up a few bits and pieces here. So this, on the actual picker itself, needs to talk to the canvas. And it wants the set brush strength function. We're going to link up our label and our slider. Slider itself, we need to link up the on value changed, so it's correctly talking to this. So good so far. Brush scale, we do a very similar process. We link up our label and our slider. We link up our value changed on the actual UI picker itself to the canvas. And then we link up our slider. And that gets, and is talking to the actual one for the scale picker. So that's one way of the direct, sort of the links. We need to also, with the paintable canvas, link up firstly brush strength. So that gets linked. We do a similar thing for brush scale. We link that up like that. I'm going to save all of that. I'm also going to update the prefab. I'm going to apply all of that. So let's test and just see, have we linked up everything? So no errors, at least initially, so that's promising. I can draw, I mean, see if I hold the mouse down, it does fill up. If I adjust the strength way up, then that, hard to tell if it's necessarily making much of a difference. If I turn it way down, then we do notice much more of a difference. If I turn it way up, it does fill faster. So that's something where, what I would say with that is that probably means the strength, we actually want to allow a larger maximum value on the slider. I think we actually want to give it a bit more of a range there. Can test with that. And if I up the strength to max, then we really notice the difference. It fills very quickly. And we'd see that with the multicolored as well. So that's good, strength is working. So what about scale? Let's crank up the scale a bunch. I can see that very definitely is working. If I switch to a different brush. So our scale setting is working quite nicely. If I change to a completely different color, we'll be able to see it more easily. So that's good. We've got brush strength working, we've got brush scale working, and we should notice that those work okay with the undo system. If I go and move the strength around a bunch, same with scale. Scale does take a little bit of a hit there because it is actually needing to regenerate data for the brush itself. But if I undo those, see the scale is changing. So we've got the ability to undo each of those setting changes until we get to a point where we're back at the defaults. So that's good. We've got our ability there now to use multicolored brushes. We've got our ability to, from the UI, control the strength and the scale of things. We've also fixed up sort of a potential issue there with setting up new brushes where it was tending to hold on to data that it shouldn't be trying to hold on to. So we've got all of those bits and pieces there that we wanted up and running. So dive on in and experiment with this, see if there are other things that you would like to add or ways that you might want to be incorporating this into your own projects. But just dive on in and see what you can make happen with it. Try out a whole bunch of different brushes. Do remember, if you are adding in additional textures, that you need to make sure you enable that read-write Otherwise, you're going to get that error that will prop up. And also, if you're using alpha in the brushes for the non-tintable ones, then you need to make sure that you enable alpha transparency on the textures when you've imported them as well. Really, really easy to miss. It'll stand out if you don't have that setting there, but it's just a really useful thing to make sure that you're sort of keeping track of that. So folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub, and there is a link to that in the description below. You can use that code in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. And if you've got any questions, then chuck those in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description as well. But until next time, bye.